Good evening, Molweni Nonke, and welcome to Amaqhawe Ethu, the show that celebrates the heroes who carried the torch of freedom, truth, and justice. I'm your host, Fundis Kweya. Tonight, we are deeply honored to be joined by a man whose life has been inseparable from the struggle for human dignity and intellectual liberation, Professor Bani Pityana. From the turbulent years of student activism under apartheid to his leadership in academia and faith-based institutions, Professor Pityana has remained a steadfast voice for moral leadership and African self-determination. And today we honor Professor Bani Pityana, the theologian, the scholar, the human rights advocate, and one of the architects of Black consciousness movement. His life stands as a testament to enduring power of conviction and the courage to speak truth to power. As we mark the 19th October 2025, we also remember that on that particular day, 48 years ago, the apartheid regime banned all Black consciousness organizations, silencing movements that dared to awaken the spirit of Black pride and resistance. Yet these voices were never truly silenced. They echoed through the lives and work of leaders like our guest tonight. Professor Bani Pityana, welcome to Amaqhawe Ethu. It's great to have you today.
Molweni Potani, enkosi Fundi for invitation to come here. Molweni Nonke, Amaqhawe Ethu upon the choir.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. And we'll start at the beginning. We're just going to have a conversation. And we'll start right at the beginning. There was a young man from the Eastern Cape growing up in a time of great political, social upheaval. And what were some of the formative experiences that shaped your political consciousness and your belief in the dignity of the African person?
Thank you very much for that question. Mm-hmm. It takes me back. You know, I was born in Uitenhage,
yes,
and in 1945. Mm-hmm. And I don't come from a family of political activism,
yeah,
that I can remember.
Mm-hmm.
I come from a family of, relatively normal township people, not even that highly educated, but enlightened, I think.
Yes.
And for whom education was a very, very important thing. So growing up, in my early years, the introduction of band education was a very formative experience for me as a little boy. There was a call for the boycott of schools, I think in 1955, at the time of the introduction and the ANC, I now know, called for the boycott, and they were getting families and children not to send their schools to band education schools. Yeah. Until then, of course, schools were church schools. And I was, as a family, were in an Anglican school. There was an Anglican school, a Methodist school, etc. So we went to this Anglican school called St. Anne's. Everybody in our family went to that school. And I just remember how there was myself, my brother, and 2 or 3 of our cousins. We were kind of smuggled into the school in my family because they couldn't bear the notion of children not going to school. For them, the idea of taking children out of school was totally anathema. I'm talking about people who were not necessarily educated, but people who could not believe the strategy that children must not go to school. And the ANC, to ameliorate that, establish schools in the streets and everywhere in order to support children and families who don't go. But in our case, in our family, we were to go to school.
Yes.
So that was my first inkling of political impact on this. After that, we then moved to live in New Brighton in Port Elizabeth. And I went to school at Moliva Higher Primary School, and throughout that time, after Moliva Primary School, I went to Lovedale.
Yes.
And that was a time, 1960, of the declaration of South Africa as a republic, as an Afrikaner apartheid republic.
Yes.
And that was also the time when there were protests about passes. Right down outside our home, there was the banning of passes, and the leadership of the ANC at that time, I knew no other, were actually demonstrating the idea that passes must be burnt. So passes were being burnt outside our house. So we come back from school, we participate in the burning of passes. We didn't have passes ourselves, but we participate in the burning of passes. And I also remember that we were also asked to go from door to door selling New Age newspapers in the New Press. For me, it wasn't even a political act. What it was, we were doing what we were told to do by the elderly people in the area. Not even in our own family, by the way. And we're doing what needed to be done. But because I was at Lovedale, and Lovedale school closed, and there was a lot of political consciousness at school, that was really my real beginning and opening to the politics of that day. We were junior, we were very, very young. At the age of 15, I found myself in an ANC cell group, because by this time the liberation movements were banned. I found myself there not for no other reason but that I was following a friend of mine, Ndaki, who I just followed him. And next thing I find myself in a cell group which Chris Hani was discussing about I remember so well about the M plan those days, because how do you survive operating underground? So for me, that was the real political consciousness. Lovedale for me was a changing idea of real consciousness about the politics of our country. And to the extent that it was at Lovedale that I found my way, almost involuntarily, but I found my way in an ANC cell group, and from that moment I never looked back. I was part of the ANC Youth League, and when that was banned, I was part of the African Students Association. I found myself taking part in the leadership of ASA. And I found myself exposed to more and more leaders of the ANC. All our senior people, Form 1, Form 5, Form 4, became very, very prominent people who we're looking up to as young people in our age. So school for me, rather than home, school was the place where the politicization took place.
Fantastic, fantastic, Professor. Now, as one of the founding members of the South African Students Organization, which is SASO in short, and which has a deep intellectual and political history, and you're one of the people with a vision behind of what would mean for black youth at the time, to say black is beautiful and black is you know, for people to sort of embrace their blackness, you know. So could you tell us about your role within the student movement and some of the activities that you were involved in during the time?
I mentioned earlier that I was involved in the ANC underground. I was also involved in the African Students Association, which was part of the ANC movement. In 1964 or 63, I think it was 64, because in 1963, in fact, we were expelled from Lovedale. So I then went to school with many of those who were expelled. We went to Newell High School. That year, 1963, we actually agreed, a group of us agreed that we were going to actually go to exile and go and get education overseas. I remember having agreed to do this. I wasn't persuaded, I wanted to do it. But when they actually came to my house in 59 Stoker Street and knocked, when my comrades knocked and said, And I said, no, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going, I've changed my mind. I'm staying put, because I had this idea that whatever happens, I must pass my metric, I must get my metric. And because that would have disturbed that. And even though we're told that we'll go to school and all of that, I said, no, I stay put, I'm going nowhere. So that was the first decision I made about preference to education, because I didn't think that it was going to work for me to find myself in a place, in a land that I did not know. After that, with us and all of that, it is precisely because of my experience of being at Lovedale and being expelled from school and being close to Fort Hare and coming back to New Brighton and getting involved in the African Students Association, that when I was at Lovedale in 1965, I think it was it 65, 66, because I took a year off. In 1966, I went to Lovedale. As a first-year student, though I was actually quite vocal, precisely because so many of the people from Lovedale were there. So I was very familiar with the environment. I was a newcomer, but I was actually very familiar. So Fort Hare gave me a real opportunity to be vocal and to actually, even from my early years, to express myself in a style of the leadership, so much so that quite a number of students began to actually listen to what I had to say. Now, that was unique, because as a first-year student, there was a view that first years must be seen and not be heard.
Yeah.
But I changed the rules, I think, because I was quite articulate and I was very knowledgeable, and so I got in. So the transition then, in my view, from Congress politics, if you like, to the Black Consciousness movement had something to do with my context. My context being New Brighton, my context being, you will not know, in 1963-64 in New Brighton, the security police were so active. Everybody around was being sent to jail. There were trials and there were widows and people were going to jail. So much so that people were afraid, the terror that people were living under in New Brighton of security police. And there were people like Gazo, who was a prominent security person who lived in the township.
Yeah.
And there were others. Now, during that time, many people were sent to jail. And people would never even mention politics.
Oh, wow.
They would even say, "Ay, babanjwe ilendi pandlap."
Yo.
So ilendi ngulu, ilendi pandlap. So the terror that the community felt about the politics at that time was enormous. And yet, some like me felt so much that this can't be. And when they were, some people were not even in jail for a long time. Some people were 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. By 1965, most of the people in jail were being released, and they were being exiled, if you like, to Thornhill or Dimbaza or something like that. So they were released from jail in order to be sent away in banishment.
Oh my God.
So people were separated from their families. They had served their sentences, but they were not allowed to remain and live in the area. So in the light of this, it took a lot of rethinking the politics of the time, because it seemed to us that the idea of attempting to do politics in the old idiom can never work again.
Yeah.
Because we had to say to ourselves, what is it that means that we're not getting through? Because we were aware the fear that the people were living under, the terror they were living under. How do you actually begin to instill in people a new confidence about politics that gives them the responsibility? Now, about this time, the Bandustans were being established. So that was a triumph of apartheid. That was anathema to us. At this time, there were liberal politics were coming. People were beginning to think that there's going to be some white people somewhere who are going to liberate us. Thirdly, there were people who think that, we're going to be liberated, by Cuba or by Russia and all of that. The Red Army was going to come. So we were saying, no, it can't work that way. Unless you actually liberate yourselves, nobody else is to come flying in to liberate you.
Yes.
So we had to instill this idea of dependence on themselves and nobody else. So Black consciousness really began to say that after so much that has been happening, it's about time that we begin to change the idiom. We begin to say to people, liberation is your responsibility and it's nobody else's. And in order to say that, we need to really address the key factors. We need to people have confidence in the capacity of Black people to be their own liberators.
Wow.
Two, we need to help Black people to address the question of fear. That was really mesmerizing them at this time. Finally, we need to say to people, you need to have your own strategy, because you can't be looking to the Helen Suzmans of this world and others because they have their own agenda. You must actually have your own agenda of liberation yourselves. So through the conversations we were having in the student movement at that time, because some of us were involved in the National Union of South African Students, some of us were not. But I was involved in the Christian students movement.
Yes.
In particular for me was involvement in the University Christians movement. Even then, we were saying that there was the SCM, that it actually, the old SCA was divided apartheid-wise, so that there's a student Christian movement for Africans, for colors, for Indians, for white people. And we said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with that. So because they started that, so we started the University Christian movement.
Wow.
And the University Christian movement in 1967 was a radicalizing forum. And at that time, the NUSAS was not allowed in many campuses. And because it was not allowed in many campuses, not many Black students were really part of it in a sense. And yet, the SCM was allowed. So the University Christian movement started bringing together students from all universities, Black and white, and from all denominations. So for me, the ecumenical movement began to be an agency for liberation. Even in 1967, as a second-year student at university. By 1968, we had gathered enough strength that at the conference of the UCM, we had a stutterime. We were able to say, we form a Black caucus within the UCM, and that Black caucus staged something that was unheard of then.
Wow.
Where we said that we're no longer going to defy the past laws by walking a certain mileage in order to get past, because there was after 72 hours, you're in another area rather than where your pass says you are. You had to break that and come back again and start notionally a new 72 hours. I said, no, we're not going to do that. So we then challenged everybody to march with us, and that we will not run away from the police and whatever they have. We will all lie down and we'll be mowed down together. So the activism of Black students transformed that organization into becoming more than itself, so that it became, in many ways, the auxiliary base for Black consciousness in the country. And so when I was then among students who were expelled in 1968 from Fort Hare, at that time I was doing my third year of a BA law degree. expelled, it meant that in no time I was nowhere. Of course, I took some principal positions, which were just me. I decided that if I'm expelled from the university, I'm not going to write my exams in some cupboard somewhere that we were asked to do by UNISA. So I wasn't going to do that. So I made to myself my boycott a very real radical step that I was taking. So I didn't actually write my exams that year.
Wow.
So because I was soon after that, I was then beginning to think that I must go overseas. So I applied for scholarships overseas. I did get a scholarship, but I was refused a passport.
A visa. Okay.
So being refused a passport, I toyed with the idea. Those days, there used to be a thing called exit permit, which South Africa actually let you go. And but in my case, they wouldn't even let me have an exit permit. They wanted to make sure that I stay right there. So I didn't get that. So strangely enough, Steve had been in conversation with, we were in conversation with Steve Biko since 1967. We were at school together at Lovedale. We were expelled together in 1963 at Lovedale. We were at university at about the same time as well. He was at the medical school, I was at Forte. So we were involved together in the University Christian movement. We were very active in student life in different places. So then the formation following our Black Caucus, we then decided on a strategy that would institutionalize the potential for black people standing up for themselves. So that meant that we had to have the inaugural meeting and working with this idea, and Steve shaped it in a wonderful way. So then I found myself moving to Durban at the medical school, where we could actually function in a meaningful way. And that's how it is that I became the president following Steve, and I later became the general secretary of the South African Students' Organization that we had formed at that time. So I spent 5 years living in Durban as a student who was a dropout from university, working up and down this country. So those were the most formative years of my life as a young person, living a student life with other students, organizing all the campuses of the country, traveling up and down our country during that time. That was a thing that really formed me and shaped me beyond anything that I could have imagined at that time.
Wow. That is very interesting, Professor, because one can only imagine, especially from our generation, that having to mobilize and organize during an era where there was no social media,
nothing,
there were no cell phones, you could only rely on the landlines. That's really interesting, and
that's right.
It took a special skill, because I cannot imagine myself, for instance, having to move and organize so many people without a cell phone. We will just have to go to the break shortly and come back and to discuss more, especially in terms of the October 19th and what it meant to your generation, and also your incarceration and some of the positions that you've held within the Democratic South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us at home. We'll be heading now to the commercial break, and we will be back shortly with Professor Pityana still discussing with us about some of his political involvements and some of his contribution in fighting against apartheid and actually liberating society in our country. Thank you so much. See you shortly after the break. Good evening again, and welcome to Amaqhawe Ethu. We are back with Professor Pityana to discuss more on his life and legacy and his political life. And now we're moving more towards the Democratic South Africa, but first we have to talk about this. Prof, we cannot discuss your generation without talking about October 19, October 1977, which is popularly known as the Black Wednesday, or the day in which the Black consciousness movements were banned and the Black newspapers, you know, and some of the key leaders of the Black consciousness movements and political parties were incarcerated at that time. So I want to understand exactly from you, what was the atmosphere like, and what do you believe that they represented, especially how did you personally experience the repression and the fear of those years, you know, especially that time?
Thank you very much. Let me just start by giving you a bit of background, because on the I think 6th of February 1973, 8 of us were banned by the apartheid system in the Black consciousness movement, and 8 white people, white students and all of that were banned. So, so 16 of us were banned at the same time. It was a wonderful balancing act by the apartheid system. So being banned, until then I was living in Durban as a leader of the student movement. And then I came to PE to come to be made to stay at my mother's house in New Brighton, 59 Stockwell Street. So coming, you know, I didn't finish my degree, right? So that was a time that I then committed to finish my degree. But that was disrupted a lot, in particular in 1974. The Free Frelimo rallies were held. And with my banning order and house arrest that I lived under, we were then arrested and sent, when they were investigating this. It's then that I realized that the Boers, the apartheid system, was a lot more afraid of us than really we deserved. And because they seemed to have the idea that we were planning a major revolution, and we didn't have any means to do a revolution. So that led to the SASO BBC trials in 1976. And I had the great fortune of having supportive, so Mr. Kondile and Mr. Somyalo were running a practice in New Brighton. So they invited me to join them to actually do articles with them. So I was actually doing, under house arrest, I was doing articles with D. Kondile and Somyalo in New Brighton. I managed to finish my degree. I then finished my law degree. Fantastic. While I was doing that. At the same time, when I finished my law degree in 1976, the apartheid system then decided that I was not to practice. I was banned from practice as a lawyer. Now I'm qualified now and ready to practice, but I got a banning order that prevented me from practicing.
Whoa.
So in but the important thing though is not so much what happened to me, is the impact and the effect a presence of somebody in a place like New Brighton had. And people actually knew that I had security police following me from my home, 44 Sandler Street, to Dikondile and Somyalo, to court. And so wherever you are, people, this time, people were not so much afraid, because if they stopped me in the street and talked to me, the police would be onto them.
Oh my God.
And many people, the support I had in New Brighton was just simply out of this world. Because people could see that here's somebody who's targeted by the security police, right in New Brighton and in my workplace and elsewhere. Now, having been refused admission in 1977, but I was, at this time I was going in, I had another long, 12 months in fact, following 1976. I was in prison for 12 months. So when Steve was and Peter Jones were arrested in Grahamstown, on the 15th of August, 1977, I was picked up by security police to be detained.
Whoa.
I was actually detained incommunicado, solitary confinement, etc., at Bacan Street Police Station that used to be in the city CBD during that time. So in a sense, I had no idea what was going on outside. I had no communication with outside. The only people I had was a policeman who was guarding my cell and bring me water, etc., every day. But the amazing thing happened, because there was a day when suddenly I find that this colored policeman had been removed. And there was now a white young man who was actually put there. And this white young man, who's a constable, when he opened the door, he saw me, and he said in real shock and surprise, "Here, meneer de procureur, wat soek jy hierso?" And he was shocked to find, as far as he was concerned, an attorney, because at this point I had the right of appearance in court. I had clients and all of that. And that young man, probably 18 years old or something like that, straight out of school, looked after me. He made sure that I read newspapers every day, which he was not supposed to do.
Wow.
So it was through him that I got to know that Steve Biko had been killed.
Oh my God.
And I was in this cell with this young man. This young man didn't know what to do with me. He had no idea who Steve Biko was and all of that. He didn't make the connections. He was just an innocent young fellow who was just a very decent 18-year-old, straight out of school. But the shock and the horror and the anger that I experienced that time, I can't talk about it anymore in a very real sense. And the sense of hopelessness and powerlessness that you actually had, you get thrown into the cell and you're left alone.
Isolated.
So, and then I was removed after that, within days of this story of Steve Biko being killed, which angered me to know, and I could have killed somebody. I was then suddenly removed from Bacan Street Police Station and taken in a sort of roundabout way, and I got to understand that I was at the Alexander Police Station at this point. It took me time to do this because I was just thrown in there. So I was at Alexander Police Station. Fortunately about that, because there were cells all around, so I started hearing young people who were thrown into jail at this time as well. They were talking and all of that. So I then told them who I was. Hey man, I then began to hear what was going on in the township. What was going on in the township at this point. This was around after Steve had died. And the police didn't tell me that Steve had died. This security policeman didn't, and they couldn't. The only time they came eventually was when they were saying that, we come to see if you can help us, because the situation in the township is totally out of hand. Because the young people are burning everywhere and all of that. They need somebody like you to talk to them. I say, you must be out of your minds. I'm not going to lift a finger. So I stayed in there, and it was while I was in Alexandria Police Station that the banning orders came. I became aware of it because there were young people who were being thrown in jail and taken out in and out of jail and going to court and all of that. So I actually, for the first time, I became aware of what was going on. And the bannings on that 19th of October 1977, is that right? I heard from within the prison that I was in. And I also heard from the young people who were being thrown in jail, who were protesting, who were fighting, who were resisting, and who were burning and all of that about them. Then I began to see my colleagues who were attorneys. They got to know that I was there as well. So they would come, there was a court next to the police station, if I'm not mistaken. So they would then come, Herbert Fisher, Silas Ganunu, and come and tell me what was going on over the window.
Okay, interesting.
So at this point, I became aware of the banning order of newspapers, of the activists in the BC movement, activists in SASO. Again, another set of banning orders, as well as newspapers and some prominent people who really assisted us in every way possible. As soon as that went, we then were served with another order that then, which I think was in November now, end of November, we sent with another order that put us in, not in a Section 6 Terrorism Act order, but this was now Section 10 of the Terrorism Act, which basically said that we were being put in detention for our own protection, because if we're not in detention, the likelihood is that we're going to do things that are going to get the system to send us into jail. So it was supposed to be, it was called preventive detention.
Whoa.
To save us from ourselves. So we were in preventive detention. Because it was preventive detention, the terms of this prevention were slightly different from others, in the sense that you could get food from family, you could be visited, and we were in communal cells.
Okay.
So a whole group of us from PE, about 12 if I'm not, or 15, I'm not sure, were put together in this communal cell in preventive detention. And it is frankly then that I really got to understand what really in truth had been going on.
Okay.
And the activities, and now these were people like Peter Jones, who had been with Steve and had been through hell. Fortunately for me, at this point, I was never tortured or touched. I was not even interrogated, by the way. The reason I know is because they were not looking for anything from me. They just wanted me to stop the summons that I was going to issue against the Minister of Police, because Mogi Tlagisani had been tortured mercilessly.
Okay.
And they were trying to get Mogi to instruct me to withdraw this summons. I told Mogi that I'm not going to. So they thought the best thing to do is to take me and put me in jail.
Yeah.
So it was as trivial as that what got me to jail. But it told me something else. It told me also that without us knowing it, I think once again the system really took us more seriously than we deserved. We were and we were not training, we were not armed, we were not all of that. But as a result of all of that, this is a bridge that you want to know about. As a result of all of that, a lot of young people were highly politicized. So two things happened. That the people were looking for an alternative that was more radical to the Black consciousness movement. So a group of our leaders, student leaders, left in 1970, I think 73 or 74, if I'm not mistaken, with the sole intention of going to join the armed struggle. Because they felt that there was nothing else that was going to work except armed struggle. So that began a flow of Black consciousness people going into exile in droves for no other purpose than to train, to looking for a place where they would train in order to train and come back to the country and liberate their country.
Fantastic.
And the real politicization, in my view, took place during that time. Mm-hmm. So that's why I say, in many ways, Black consciousness, SASO, whatever you call it, BPC, was a bridge.
Yeah.
A bridge that moved people from where they were and where we had moved them from another space that we felt was not going to help them to another one, where they really were so conscientized and so politicized that they made a commitment, what we like to think was a life commitment. It's about putting their lives
fantastic
on the block.
Okay, Prof. Now let's move to the democratic South Africa. We see now that there are new challenges, not just the challenges of the regime, but from a moral decay to corruption and a loss of purpose in leadership. Do you think we have honored the ideals of of which your generations fought for?
We have not, if you look at it today, but that's not fair to look at it today. But in truth, we started well. We started well under Mandela and under Mbeki. There was visible things that were happening, and we were proud to be South Africans. I was the first chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission.
Wow.
And I left a teaching position at UCT when I was invited to become chairperson of the Human Rights Commission. We started the Human Rights Commission from nowhere, from nothing, and we sought to develop this human rights culture in our country. It's important also to say that we must not think that there was no hope. It was not easy, but there was a whole group of people, unfortunately, part of building a new country and a new society meant that some of our best people were moving away from parliament and from politics into business. So that's why many people, Saki Makozoma and others, have become just very, very prominent business people, prominent in business. It's important also to say that until that time, for me, the era of having Jacob Zuma as president was where the ANC let down this country in a big way. But so let down that the ANC actually did not know how to get out of it themselves.
Okay.
And they knew that the insistence on Jacob Zuma as a president was really the beginning of the death of the movement itself. So in no time there was a popular movement saying to the ANC against that. But the ANC as ANC called us names, and they just thought that we were renegades of one kind or another. But they did not pay attention to what was going on. And what they did, they created a cadre of people who were not interested in all those wonderful things that Mandela and the ANC were talking about. They brought in the worst in us. The sense in which people wanted to be rich quick, the resources of the state became, if you like, a potty jar that they could actually loot. But the ANC did not do anything. Even when it became quite clear that the ANC could not proceed like that in a sustainable way. In 2018, for me, it was unbelievable that the ANC would elect Zuma for the second term. I mean, for me, that was it. Because I thought it was bad enough in 2012 or something like that. Yeah. It was bad enough for the ANC to elect Zuma in 2012. It was bad enough. But for ANC to re-elect Jacob Zuma in 2017,
I think it was the re-election.
2017 to re-elect him again, for me, it was it was the end. And for many people, there was nothing that Jacob Zuma could produce for this country that would improve. Not possible. And the ANC was dragged in the same way as well. Then they brought in Cyril Ramaphosa, who for many of us was a hope. We really did believe that Cyril would bring enthusiasm about the Constitution, about doing the good things, and he tried. But he could not, this is my diagnosis, he could not give leadership to the ANC that he was leading. So under Cyril, nothing really seemed to change very much. Notwithstanding Tumamina and all of that, we knew that he meant it. We knew that he wanted the best for the people, he wanted the best. But he wasn't going to do it without doing the unpopular things. Yeah. And he wasn't ready to do the unpopular things that needed to be done. And so the ANC went down and down, down until last year. In my view, there's no future for the ANC. But then what's the position for the country? But the country can't blame ANC. You and I can't blame ANC. It's not just the ANC, it's you and I. Because we are the voters. Yeah. We are the one who go to the voting booth.
And we need to keep leaders accountable.
That's right. And we are the ones who must make leaders accountable. So it's not just the ANC. It is the democratic system that has let us down. It has not produced what it does. So we must think afresh. So I do slightly think that the idea of a dialogue is about time. That we engage with each other to dialogue about the future. There are things about the Constitution that needs to be looked at again, and whether it served us. We must look at our economy, our economic system. Who exactly does the economy serve? Who do we intend it to serve? And therefore, the whole restructuring must take place. So that needs to happen, and it must happen yesterday. Yeah. Because South Africans are fed up. They can't take it anymore, and the democracy is at risk the way it goes. So we've got to move away from ANC to particular leaders to ourselves.
Fantastic, fantastic, Prof. Now, Prof, before we go, we close because, you know, I can't believe it's almost an hour already. Our time is almost up, you know. Now, looking at my generation and below, or even other generations that are still coming up and who are considered the future of the country, you know, looking at that generation, what would you advise them going forward in terms of how do we take the country that we are about to inherit from your generation, how do we take it forward? Or how do we rescue it from the kind of challenges that we're faced with as a nation?
Thanks for that. Let me say two things. One is that for my money, I spent nearly 10 years as the principal and vice chancellor of a big university, the biggest in this country. There were times when I was on the council of Wits University when the fees must fall was happening. Oh. There were times of total despair on my part because I believe in young people so much, in the potential for young people to be the change makers, to be the radical voice. And that because that's what we were in my time. I believe that is important. Last weekend, recently on the 3rd of October, I had the amazing privilege of speaking to a great hall full of students on a Friday evening. And I came to realize, I think, for the first time, that actually the young people of our time at universities and all of that are really thinking very hard about their own future, about their own future in this country, so that they're no longer, if you like, just following the political trends and benefit from being in the ANC and taking whatever it takes to be there as young people are beginning to say, but this is not good enough. And we ourselves are the leaders for our country right from now, not in the future, not at this time. and we must contribute to the shaping of that idealism about our country. So having seen that actually amazing, I spent the whole evening with students that evening at WITS. And then I come back home. Last week, I find that students at Forte had burnt 6 buildings and infrastructure at the university. I don't know the circumstances. I am not in that scene. But whatever it is, the idea of students burning buildings of their own university, for me, it's not something. Then I want to find out, and I want to say to myself, what's the future for all of us? What is the future? The future can only be that we must actually build communities of salvation, communities of redemption, communities of liberation. We have to do that.
Wow, that's a mouthful. It's a pity we only have an hour. I think we will definitely need a repeat when you have time.
Thank you.
There's a lot to get from you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening with Professor Panepityana, who reminds us that leadership begins with conscience and that freedom without moral purpose is hollow. As we commemorate the banning of black organizations on the 19th October 1976, may we recommit ourselves to rebuilding a nation anchored in truth, justice, and human dignities. To our viewers, let us remember Amaqhawe to live not only in history books, but in the values we embody today. Thank you, Professor, for your wisdom and enduring service to our nation. Thank you.